The time is just gone 16 minutes past 9 a.m. and we now focus on the elections in Syria. We join on the line by AMEC, Afro Middle East Centre's Executive Director, Jeena. Naeem, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Okay, Naeem is
Walaikum
going to be
salam.
joining us shortly. Yes, he is. Naeem, Assalamu alaikum.
Walaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Welcome and Jazakallah, as always, for joining us. Now, obviously, we're talking about the Syrian elections and upfront, I need to ask you, is there something such as a free and a fair election in a country like Syria right now?
No. There isn't. I mean, look, you might ask the question whether there ever has been, and my answer to that would be no as well. But of course, right now and 7 years ago in 2014, circumstances were even more different than previously.
Yes. Now, let's just unpack the elections. Now, obviously, the country is war-ravaged at this point in time, and the timing of the elections, whether it is a good time to have elections in Syria. But again, where we're talking for someone about someone like Bashar al-Assad, we're talking about opposition that are in exile, and can an election ever be possible? And what the people of Syria, at the end of the day, those that are voting, what does this actually mean for them?
Well, firstly, that in terms of the timing, the Assad regime is intent that it continues as if things are normal in Syria. So Bashar al-Assad was elected in a referendum in 2000 and then confirmed in a referendum in 2007. I say referendum rather than election because that's exactly what it was. You vote yes or no for whether he should be president. 7 years later in 2007, then 7 years later in 2014, the first time was an election with actual contenders. And then 7 years later, now in 2021. So they continue with this 7-year elections as if everything is normal, as if things haven't changed in a sense. The one difference between 2014 and now compared to previously was that 2014 was you actually had a choice of who to vote for. In the previous two referenda, Bashar al-Assad got something like 97, 98% of the vote. They say in 2014 89% of the vote against another contender, and this time around I doubt that it will be any different, something between 88% and 94% or so should be what he would get, despite the fact that there were two contenders, quite unknown contenders, of course. The point is that right now you're looking at a situation where out of a population of about 22 million, 21 million, remember that about 500,000 Syrians have been killed in the civil war in the past decade, that out of a population of about 21 million, 6 million are refugees outside of Syria. 7 million are internally displaced, of whom 4.5 million live in rebel-controlled areas, and so they were not able to vote. About 2 million live in areas controlled by the American-supported Kurdish groups, the SDF. They were not able to vote. So about 12 million of the people, I'm talking about total population, this is not the voting population, about 12 million out of 21 million people were not able to participate in any kind of election. If half the population is unable to participate, is it a real election? And secondly, of course, the usual thing that there are two candidates who are quite unknown. One of whom is a member of the so-called internal opposition, but unknown with no real constituencies. And they came up against Bashar al-Assad, who has the resources of the state behind him, as well as economic resources of his family, etc., who have benefited from his control of the state. And that's all the resources that have been brought to bear. Whether it's accurate or not, there's little doubt that the official result will be that Bashar al-Assad will be elected president with about 90% of the vote.
In a name years ago, and you will recall, we coined the phrase in South Africa: "No abnormal sport, no normal sport in an abnormal society." And this is exactly the case in Syria, where you cannot have normal elections considering the circumstances. And the key issue here is again Bashar al-Assad reinforcing that he wants this firm grip to power in Syria.
Yes, and remember also that in 2015, the United Nations Security Council passed a resolution, which means that it wasn't vetoed by even Syria's ally on the Security Council, Russia, passed a resolution that there should not be elections until a new constitution was drawn up. There has been no new constitution drawn up since then. There's no attempt at kind of ensuring any greater or deeper democracy in Syria, of being inclusive, etc. And the election has gone ahead. It's not, as you say, as you suggest, it's not a normal election.
Yes. Now, obviously, there has been a lot of criticism with Bashar al-Assad as far as these elections are concerned. Even the likes of the US, the EU, talking about these elections not being free and fair, being a farce. And Assad, on the other side, in his campaign trail, using the slogan "Hope through work." And obviously, he is now thinking along lines of reconstruction to rebuild the country. But at the end of the day, he needs money, and he requires billions of dollars. And will that money ever be coming to Syria?
Well, I think that that money will not come through immediately, certainly not from Western countries. I don't think that Russia is going to be pouring in money into Syria either. Russia has its own economic problems, and Russia is hoping that it would benefit from the end of the Syrian civil war through getting reconstruction contracts rather than putting aid money in. What we might see in the immediate aftermath of the election is a pretense by some of the most prominent dictatorships in the region, such as the UAE, which has already renewed diplomatic links with Syria, as well as Saudi Arabia. Not paragons of democracy in themselves, of course, who will pretend that with this election now, things have returned to normal, and might start funding reconstruction projects, partly in order to kind of normalize Syria, partly in order to pull Bashar al-Assad and Syria over to their side in the kind of battle with Iran. Iran, of course, living under more than 40 years of sanctions, is scarcely able to provide for its own population, let alone provide huge amounts of reconstruction aid for Syria. So that is the calculation from the UAE and Saudi Arabia. I think we might see announcements soon of Emirati and Saudi funding to that reconstruction, but not from the Western powers, at least not immediately. Once the UAE and Saudi normalize, then there might be some of that coming in. The reality is that Syria is big parts of Syria are completely destroyed, need tons of money for the reconstruction, and half of the population is displaced. Even if you're able to rebuild buildings, etc., you cannot reconstruct those lives.
In fact, I was going to raise this issue about Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and just to understand the wisdom or the thinking as to how this would work in the interest of both Saudi Arabia and the UAE in terms of funding Syria.
For the UAE, a big part of their agenda in the region and beyond the region is political influence. They like to throw their money around in order to buy influence among different governments and different regimes all over the place. Whether you're talking about southern separatists in Yemen, whether you're talking about Mohammed Dahlan in the Palestinian context, whether you're talking about Sisi in Egypt, whatever the case might be, they throw their money around in order to be able to control the politics, etc., of different countries. So for them, gaining a foothold in terms of having influence over Syria is extremely important, and of course there will be economic benefits of that as well. Also, that in the past there has been a close relationship before the civil war, a close relationship between Syria and Turkey. The UAE is rabidly opposed to Turkey and any influence Turkey might have anywhere. So that's one of the other issues there. For Saudi Arabia, a big issue in the region is about splitting the region between Saudi influence and Iranian influence, both of which, of course, are potential hegemons. And Saudi Arabia certainly does not want to see Iran gaining influence in the region. Iran has, for quite a while, has substantial influence in Syria. It started, of course, with Syria supporting Iran after the revolution, when Gulf Arab countries opposed Iran, and then the relationship turned, where Iran was supporting Syria and certainly supported it very strongly through the civil war. Bashar al-Assad is at a point now where he believes that he doesn't really need Iran anymore. And if he gets good enough offers from the likes of the Emiratis and Saudis, he would rather go in that direction. This is fairly typical Bashar. It's not, he's not principled and loyal in that same kind of way. So for Saudi Arabia, pulling Syria away from the Iranian orbit, from the Iranian what is called the axis of resistance, would be very important in terms of maintaining what they believe is a kind of Arab unity as far as Iran is concerned. It will also help, from their perspective, to break the link between Hezbollah, the land link at least, between Hezbollah in Lebanon and Iran. And that for them is important because it would strengthen their hand in Lebanon as well. And so there's a lot, and of course, that Saudi Arabia would like to have a Syria that is indebted to it economically in the long term. So there are all of these kinds of geopolitical reasons why Saudi could be interested in moving in, after the Emirates has already done so, into Syria.
And just finally, Naeem, how would this play out in the hands of the Zionist entity? Because moving away from Iran obviously is one issue, but on the other hand, we've seen the UAE, we see Saudi Arabia, and the number of Arab countries that are now obviously enjoying links with Israel.
Yeah, look, one thing we must be clear about is that despite the rhetoric, despite the propaganda, and despite the fact that officially Syria has been in a state of war with Israel for the past decades, the reality is that there hasn't been a war between Syria and Israel. The reality is that there are parts of the border, what might be called the border between Syria and Israel, that are completely open. Where if Syria wanted, Palestinian refugees could stream across into Israel if they so desired. But Syria is the one that has ensured that that doesn't happen. In fact, Bashar, around 2010, before the uprisings began, made this comment in one interview that the Syria-Israeli border is the most secure border in the world. And why is it the most secure border in the world? Because the Syrians ensure that it is the most secure border in the world. So, that's one piece of this kind of background to the relationship. Secondly, from the Israeli perspective, they don't want a destroyed Syria. They don't want a Syria where Assad is out. They want a Syria where Assad is still the head of the government, but a Syria that is very weak. And this is what they are getting delivered on a plate to them, frankly. Bashar al-Assad will be in power for the next 7 years until 2028. And if he's there until 2028, it means that he would have lasted as president even longer than his father, Hafez al-Assad. And from the Israeli perspective, you will have a country that is bogged down with reconstruction, a weak country that is going to pose no threat whatsoever to Israel. If they even consider giving refuge again to armed Palestinian groups. Well, just drop a bomb or two, as the Israelis have been for the past few years in various places in Syria, including around Damascus. And many people believe that this is being done by Israel with the tacit approval of Syria's greatest ally, which is Russia. So there's a whole web of relationships here, and Israel will certainly benefit from this. And if Syria moves into the Emirati-Saudi orbit, I don't think that it's going to move into its orbit fully. It's not going to be a kind of a full vassal of the Saudis and Emiratis. That's not the way in which Bashar works. But if they pulled away from Iran towards the Saudis and Emiratis, well, we know that the Emiratis have already formally normalized relations with Israel. Saudi Arabia informally has normalized relations with Israel, which means that pulling Syria into that orbit means that Syria is in the Israeli orbit. So for the Israelis, there's no lose here. It's a win-win no matter what happens in the situation. The losers will be, well, Iran will be one of the losers. Iran's influence is certainly decreasing in Syria. The biggest losers will be, of course, the Syrian population, half of whom, as I said, or quarter of whom are in are refugees outside the country, another quarter of whom are internally displaced.
Well, Naeem, very, very interesting. And Jazakallah so much for unpacking all of this with us this morning here on Salam Media. All the best to you. Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah.
Naeem, Jeena, Afro Middle East Centre Executive Director with us this morning.